Welcome everyone. Welcome to Writing on the Wall. Welcome to the Blackie. Amazing space. Thank you very much to the Blackie for allowing us to use this building this evening. Welcome to tonight's panel. Kat Lewis, Ruth Fox, Phil Redmond, Ken Loach, David Puttnam. Thanks in particular to David for bringing his roving inquiry to Liverpool. I think it's very important that he did so because, as we know, following last week's inquest verdicts, the lens of the media is focused on Liverpool at this moment in time. And we have a television industry and a broader media that's finally been forced to represent accurately the events of April 1989. So it does seem fitting that tonight we ask the question, does television represent us? Over to the panel.
Thank you. It's a very, very nice introduction. That's okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm David Puttnam. I've been chairing this inquiry now for, I think, 8 months. We will report finally on the, we think, 27th of June, which will be about 5 weeks after the white paper. It gives us a chance to review the white paper and finalise our thoughts. It's been a very interesting exercise, and tonight's our very last public meeting. We've been all over the country, learned a lot, really learned a lot, some of it quite surprising. We're doing one more session on training, the capacity of the industry to train and the role of public service broadcasting in the training component. Ken may well have something to say about that, as having come out of that world. Trying to maintain that we have very, very high training standards is fantastically important. I'd like just, as I've got the microphone, a couple of things. First of all, I actually sat by the radio and listened to the verdict come in on questions 5, 6 and 7 and cheered. I found it really emotional. As a Southerner, I found it very, very emotional experience. And something happened afterwards, and I don't have another chance to say this publicly, which I think was extraordinary. Kelvin Mackenzie was interviewed, and he said, amazingly, he started protesting about how he'd been hopelessly misled and that it was clearly a conspiracy, and how the police must have had their own agenda, and how he was made to look a fool. We in the House of Lords have been arguing for months and months and months that Leveson 2, no, not too technical about this, there was always announced 2 Leveson inquiries. The more important by far was called Leveson 2. Leveson 2 is an inquiry into a relationship, the improper relationship between the police, politicians and the media. And what occurred to me was quite brilliantly, and I'm sure accidentally, what Kelvin Mackenzie was giving the best possible argument as to why Leveson 2 has to happen. And happily, that's been picked up in Parliament, both in the Commons and the Lords. So all of a sudden, as a direct result of last week's triumph, and it was a triumph, there may be another very, very, very important bandwagon to begin rolling. So that's solid good news. The purpose of this evening is largely to listen to you. I'll sit down in a moment. I'm going to run a 6-minute clip from I think, a very, very good BBC programme, and I want to use it to make a point. After that, each one of the people on the panel will make 5, 6-minute presentation of their own views, and then we'll go to you, and I'll try and manage the affair from there on in terms of ensuring that your questions are properly answered. But the purpose of the clip, which actually appeared in 2 different seasons of the same programme, was to establish for those who didn't know it how very, very difficult it could be if you don't live in central London and if you don't have a reputation to actually get a programme on air. So enjoy this 6 minutes. I think it's fantastic. I'm going to start, if I may, asking Ruth Fox, who's a colleague of mine. She's the director of Hansard, does a fantastic job. We've known each other for a long time, to set out her stall, because it's a very informed stall. Once every year, she does the audit of political engagement. We get a sense of how the media are affecting people's views of politics. Ruth.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, David. Should just explain when he says Hansard, he doesn't mean that Hansard that you're thinking about. We're not the parliamentary record of debates. We're a political research and education charity that works to promote democracy and strengthen parliaments. So you can guess from that what the theme of my contribution tonight is going to be: the role of regional television in relation to democracy and democratic engagement, citizenship, and sustaining that. And it doesn't matter, frankly, which part of the country you live in. Citizens are disenchanted, disillusioned, and disengaged. Barely more than 6 in 10 of us vote. Only half the population say they feel interested in and knowledgeable about politics. And only 1/3 of us are satisfied with our system of governing. When it comes to our elected representatives, only 3 in 10 of us are satisfied with the role that MPs, how they do their job. And those are just a few of the rather depressing headlines about the state of democracy. We could be here all night. There are no quick solutions to addressing the democratic deficit, but the provision and portrayal of politics and politicians on television must be part of the mix. Because despite the changing media landscape, TV remains the biggest single source of people's news and information about politics. So I'm going to ask my colleague at the back just to show, just got a couple of slides because we've got a bit of data. We're a research organisation, so got some new data for you. This first slide just shows newspapers and social media don't come close to the influence of television in terms of portrayal of politics. Some may catch up in time, but right now television is the lens through which the public's view of politics is largely framed. And I would argue that in light of that, regional television is crucially important in terms of tackling the democratic deficit, because most of us actually engage with politics at the local rather than the national level. There's a greater desire among us as citizens, as our audit of political engagement shows, to get involved in politics locally rather than nationally, that remains, frankly, largely untapped. So tonight I want to focus just on one element of regional programming, that which is identifiably political in all its content and is a vehicle where we can hear direct from our elected representatives, coverage that's offered over and above that which we get through the regional news programmes like Granada Reports. Now, David has a theory that since the 1990 Broadcasting Act and the breakup of the old network of regional television companies, the commitment to explicit political programming at the regional level has declined. And as a consequence, MPs and other significant local political figures have far less of a chance to appear airing their views to their constituents, to the broader region, than was the case 30 years ago. This in turn then contributes to the wider democratic deficit at the regional level as political voice and accountability is eroded. But is this true, or is it a golden age theory? And if so, what can be done about it? So I want us just to travel back in time. We've been doing some research looking at the volume and content of political programming in the region. Take us back to 1983. That year, general election year, citizens here in the Northwest had 4 hours of dedicated programming in the form of Granada 100 programs in the run-up to that year's local elections, with a talk-back panel giving their views on the big issues at stake. For the general election the following month, a Granada 500 programme saw 500 citizens from across the north travel to London to meet the party leaders and question them on matters of concern. But that was it in an election year. Now, travel forward in time 4 years to 1987, and a new programme is launched called Members Only. Gave MPs a 5-minute opportunity on Sunday mornings at noon for them from across the region to speak out on an issue of their choice. It didn't run every week, but cumulatively provided just under 5 hours of dedicated programming, enabling most MPs in the region to have their 5 minutes worth. Now, just bear in mind that TEDx ideas worth thinking about give us all at least 10 minutes. So you can imagine not much time with the opening credits, the closing credits, to have much of a say in 5 minutes. There's also State of the Region programming, exploring what voters in the region wanted from the political parties. And the centrepiece of the election coverage was a Sunday conference entitled Case for a New North, held one Sunday with 2 hours, 10 minutes of programming interspersed throughout the day, exploring what the politicians were going to do for citizens in the Northwest. Added to that, there were then 6 Granada 500 programs mixing Q&A and deliberative discussions in key constituencies across the region, with audience questioning of the national rather than party, local regional leaders. So cumulatively in 1987, there was 15.5 hours of explicitly political programming throughout the year. But of that, just under 11 was with regional political representatives. So how does this compare to last year in the general election? Now, across every region, ITV currently commits to 30 minutes a month for 11 months a year for dedicated regional political programs. That's 5.5 hours of annual output. Those of you from this region will be familiar with Party People, presented by Rob McLaughlin last year. Goes out on a Thursday evening, 10:40, 10:45, so it's hardly peak time. And it provides a dedicated opportunity for 3 or 4 politicians to have a discussion about a range of regional, local issues. But that is conducted from a studio in Millbank at Westminster, not here in the region itself. The first 4 programmes last year were largely given over to interviews with Ed Miliband, Ed Miliband, David Cameron, George Osborne, and Nigel Farage, and about what they would do for the Northwest. Now, given the dominance already of elite politicians, reinforced by the party leaders' TV debates, I think it's worth questioning whether these limited monthly engagements are best spent effectively on issues related to the national horse race. Particularly when compared to 30 years ago, the party political landscape is so much more fragmented and a wider range of party voices need to be heard. The programme after the election, so May last year, returned to the regional scene with a scoop interview focused on Liverpool with the news that Derek Hatton had rejoined the Labour Party. And then the remaining programmes of the year focused on the NHS, extremism, assisted dying, transport problems, and police cuts. This year, the programme's been rebranded Granada Debate. It's focused, 4 programmes so far this year focused on the EU referendum, on the housing crisis, whether the region is bearing the brunt of the refugee crisis, and the funding facing hospices across the region. My question to you, I guess, is do you think that this programme content really reflects an alternative to the London bubble, the London narrative about politics? Are these the issues that citizens here in the Northwest, if they had a say, would choose as priority topics for political discussion? What engages the public interest in politics is the local level issues here at a regional level. They tend to be the most meaningful for people as they live out their day-to-day lives. So many of the subjects being covered in these programmes are important, but do they reflect the priorities of the Westminster bubble back to the region rather than the priorities of the region back to Westminster? Now, going back just briefly to the data, if we can just show the next slide, David's golden age theory doesn't quite stand up here in the Northwest. There was more dedicated political programming in 2015 than there was in 1983 and 1987. But to test his theory, we looked at a neighbouring region, Central, to see if there was a similar pattern, and here the picture is rather different, as this next slide shows. Central Region's dedicated political programme is called Central Lobby. It's not dissimilar in style to Party People and Granada Debate here. Goes out at a similarly late evening time, a similar format. In 1983, there were 20 editions at just over 12 hours of total output. 4 years later, that had virtually halved to just over 6 hours. And last year, the 11 monthly editions, of course, delivered 5.5. So here there's been a very clear decline in coverage over the years. But here's the thing, as I have dug into the data to explore David's hypothesis, I can't help thinking that this is all rather small compared to the scale of the democratic deficit we face, whether we're talking about coverage today or back in the 1980s. Add in the 15 to 20 minutes regional coverage on BBC's politics show on Sunday, and combined, we're talking about no more than 90 minutes output per month across the channels. That's the value we're placing on coverage of a democracy in our regions through the most important medium available to us. At a time when speed matters, can 30 minutes programming once a month really respond to the ways in which particularly young people want to consume content? Does the talking head roundtable discussion model have longevity? How might relevant and more compelling political programme in the region look differently? I don't deny that there are challenges in improving democratically focused output when there's such intense competition for audience share and for advertising. And there are huge challenges in conveying rich and compelling politics programmes in a fragmented party environment across such a diverse region and a large geographical footprint. But I do think television, and specifically regional television, must have a role and responsibility in cultivating and sustaining our democracy, concomitant with the size and scale of its reach and influence in terms of people's consumption of politics. We need it to make, I would argue, a greater contribution to the political literacy of citizens in every region, so that they can navigate their way through the complexities of politics today. Here in the Northwest, it was the region that pioneered by-election coverage in the 1950s in Rochdale. It was here in this region that the first ever televised hustings were held. It was this region that challenged the 14-day rule banning coverage of issues being discussed in Parliament. Hard to believe that ever existed. The question I think I would set tonight is there the creativity and the will to innovate again in that political space? And if so, how might we do it? Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. I was really relieved to see the central television figures. Phil, you're on.
Well, actually, David's right and he's wrong. I mean, the 1990 Broadcasting Act actually completely eviscerated realistic television. And it wasn't to do with the fact that how many hours or minutes of this that you ever covered, because the reality is that television, in terms of things like politics and current affairs and things, has never really adequately represented the people. It never has. I went into television in 1980 1970s, for the very reason that it actually wasn't doing that. I wanted to go in and make programs like Grange Hill and Brookside and then later on Hollyoaks, because they weren't doing that. That was the thing. And when you look at all these figures and say, oh, well, we did 5.5 hours there and we did 3 hours there. When you look at the amount of broadcasting hours, I mean, the figures are escaping me now. I used to live and breathe all these statistics every single day. But the BBC puts out something like 48,000 hours of transmission every year. And so when someone turns around and says, hey, we did 5.5 hours, isn't that fantastic? And when I ran Capital Culture, that was one of the biggest arguments I put to them, that they had 38,000 hours across their television networks, and they devoted 22 hours to Liverpool. Now, they could have done a little bit more, couldn't they, on behalf of the UK government, because that's what we were doing in Liverpool. We were the hosts of the UK government. So we've got to be careful with this question, because I believe that television has never really adequately represented the people, simply because it can't, because it was set up in 1920s with the 1920s technology, big valves, big transmitters, licenses and structures were set up to reflect that, and we've still got it. So we know in Liverpool that the main transmitter is in Winter Hill, and there's a repeater in Staunton because they forgot that actually Liverpool was in a bit of a dip. And so the signal went right across the city, so they had to put one in the Wirral to send it back. And you can't do that. You can't represent the Northwest of 6.5 million people with a transmitter from Winter Hill that does everybody. And so for years and years and years, we argued that Liverpool was overlooked by Manchester. And then when it came round to Granada getting another one of their franchise renewals, they built the Albert Dock. And they put a few programmes in there, but they were national programmes, really. And Granada Reports was just fluff. And one of the big things I used to argue with them was that Granada Report's main headlines was that Granada was actually in Liverpool. You know, and that's the kind of level it went, unless there was a strike, or Degsy and his boys were at it again, Then they came along and they told the story. Now, we've still got that problem. So when we're talking about when television actually adequately represents the people, it can't do it from that 1920s transmission pattern. These grey hairs here were arguing about getting Grange Hill on TV. It should have been in St Helens. It had to be made in London. It's arguing about getting Brookie on screen. No one else would touch it until Jeremy Isaacs launched Channel 4 and had to be different. And I said, if you come up and said to the Merseyside, everyone's skint, they'll do it on the cheap. That's why we came back. That's why we did it. Hollyoaks was supposed to be Richmond on Thames, right? And the only reason it's on is because I sent a crew to Chester, shot in Chester, told them it was Richmond on Thames, and they thought it was marvellous, right? And only when I revealed at the late stage, it's actually in Chester, Really? They've got nice people in Chester, isn't that marvellous? When Channel 4 was originally started, why didn't we have it in Manchester? Or even Birmingham? No, Phil, you don't need it, it's got to be in London. What about Channel 5 then? When Channel 5 came along, you remember all that retuning? Some of you in there, you've got grey hair, remember all that retuning about VCRs because it clashed with the transmitter pattern, right? Channels 35 and 37, Heathrow traffic, air traffic control, French national television, so they have to go around retuning everything. We said to them, set it in Manchester. There's no Channel 35 or 37 in Manchester. They can start tomorrow. Let's have it in Manchester. Let's have it in Liverpool, Manchester, Sheffield, and all that kind of alternative to London, all that kind of thing, Northern Powerhouse type things. No, Phil, you don't understand. You don't need it. Everybody's promised to do things in the north, Where did it end up? In London, Satellite was the same. British Broadcasting Satellite originally collapsed in London. Rupert Murdoch bought it and went on to Sky in London, And every time we had a new opportunity, London, never ever thinking about the regions. And that's the problem. That is where it is. We've got Salford now, Media City. Okay, decisions are still made in London. That clip, to people like me, is both bittersweet. I've been there. If that guy had longer hair, that could have been me trying to sell Grange Hill. Right? It's absolutely ridiculous. So I think the challenge is not that. The challenge is now to think for the future. How can we reconnect television, which you saw that slide there, where 75% of people get their news from TV. The thing that's missing from that slide is the demographics, because that's another issue, right? Because it's okay, 75% of the population watching telly, but actually they don't make any decisions, do they? So that's, we don't need to worry about them, So it's down to where the particular demographics are, the influence makers. When we made Brookie, there was two currencies. That was ratings and the broadsheet column inches. We had to have the Guardian, the Telegraph and the Times. And we had to have the Daily Mail. And why did we have to have the Daily Mail? Because ministers' wives read the Daily Mail, as it used to be. So I think the challenge is this, that we have to look ahead to the future. We have to think that eventually that 80-year-old transmission pattern is going to have to be broken. And they all talk about it's going to be online or whatever. But all those listening to about the superhighway and all that, sitting at home watching the spinning wheel on their screen, no, we're still not there yet. But eventually we will get there. So what can we do? Well, I think the only real answer is to finally address the problem of what do we want from our public service broadcaster. The BBC belongs to us. We pay for it. It's a compact between the public and the BBC that politicians find very difficult to break. We like the BBC. That's what it comes down to. And we need to ask, what do we want for the BBC in the future? And I think we should ask the BBC to be connected much more to its regional and local audiences. They've got the model, it's called local radio. And they've taken the cash out of it for years and years because it's a bunch of guys in London making the decisions. So we need to say, public service broadcaster, we want it connected back into our locality. We want it connected to our health. We want it connected to our education. We want to have it connected to our law and order agendas. And we want to have it connected to our devolution agendas. The Northwest, 6.5 million people, is greater than BBC Scotland, BBC Northern Ireland, and BBC Wales. They all have their own infrastructures, and they all have a lot more autonomy. Why doesn't the Northwest have it? But then it's about sustainability. We've got another public service broadcaster, and that's Channel 4. That belongs to us too, by the way. It's a public service broadcaster. I worked for them for a long time. I kept it afloat for a long time. While they were losing all the money and all the daft horse racing and all the rest of it, Hollyoaks was there, bringing the cash in, keeping them going, right? But that belongs to us too. So why don't we just put Channel 4 and the BBC in one building? Bring all the capacity of Channel 4 into the BBC. Keep the BBC revenue. Oh my God. It means, you can't be a little bit pregnant with advertising. Well, you can, because the BBC, Channel 4 is already a public service broadcaster. It's flogging the stuff on our behalf. So get rid of all the high-paid, cats at Channel 4, move them into the BBC, sell off the spectrum, and all that cash can go back into care homes and go back into dementia care that we're going to need in the future. But a lot of valuable spectrum to sell off. And commercial television, well, let it rip. Do we really care whether Granada pretends it's bringing in a few MPs to chat for 25 minutes when nobody's watching? And also, they're sitting in Manchester and they're chatting about national politics because they know if they get 3 MPs in from Bury and start chatting about the local bypass, no one's going to watch that, are they? Right? But if they get there and say, are you going to resign about Jeremy Corbyn? Are you going to resign about this? Are you going to resign about that? That becomes national television. It's not local television. So that's my solution, really. All those years, all this grey hair, it's never represented the people the way we're talking about, and it never will until we change the basic structure. Make Channel 4, BBC, let the commercials get on and make great programming,
Next up, I'm going to ask Ken Loach to speak. He needs no introduction from me at all. Ken has to leave at 8:30 on the dot, so I'm making absolutely sure we nail him for a decent amount of time. Ken.
Thanks very much. Yes, I was about to say, if I sneak off, it's not that I've been caught short, it's just that I've got to get a train at 1:45. Does television represent us? No, absolutely not. Does it do justice to the nuances and the subtleties and the intricacies of people's lives and their concerns and their worries? No, absolutely not. It never has. It has marginally done better at some times than others. But I want to come at it from a slightly different perspective from the really important contributions we've had so far, really, to say, really broadcasting is about control. Broadcasting is about ensuring that the main tenets of the state stay in place. Tony Benn said it once, Britain doesn't need the KGB, it's got the BBC. And there's a lot of truth in that. It's about control. Back in the day, there were investigative programs, there were dramas, there was the voice of the individual writer, which did give some variety, which did give some acknowledgement of the diversity of the life that we should reflect. The voice of the individual writers is very rare now. I mean, you have one in Liverpool, Jimmy McGovern, who's a terrific writer, fine writer, and he does that, and he does it brilliantly. But most writing in drama now is formulaic. The talent is there, but people are put into a situation where the formula transcends the writer, because television is about making commodities, it's not about making communications. And in the making of commodities, you have to shape it and fix it so that it will sell, and then you refine it. It has a shelf life. You sell it for as long as you can, and then you drop it. Writing, individual communication, is much more subtle. It's much more personal. It's much more driven by what people have to say. Broadcasting is now driven by commodities, not communication. It's rarely driven by unearthing something that you should know about, which we do want to know about. It's driven by questions that the powers that be are happy for you to deal with. You could, the BBC in particular, there's one story that reveals the role of the BBC absolutely, and it was at its foundation in the early 1920s. Soon after the BBC, British Broadcasting Company, I think it was then, soon after it had been established, there was a general strike. Even I don't remember the general strike, but there was one in 1926. And it was a major event. It was a week in May. And Churchill, who was in the government, wanted to deal with the BBC as an agent of government. He wanted to control it. He wanted to use it as a propaganda machine. Baldwin, who was Prime Minister, said, no, you're very crude. What is much more convincing is if people believe the BBC is independent, they will take what it says as important. If they see it as a government propaganda sheet, they will ignore it. So what happened was, Reith, who was the man in charge at the time, Lord Reith, moved into a government office. He wrote the news the government wanted the people to hear. He even considered banning the Archbishop of Canterbury from speaking, because it was thought he might be too sympathetic to the strikers. And he put out government propaganda. But the people believed it because they believed the BBC was independent. The BBC has never been independent from that day to this. And that's why it doesn't represent us, because the people have interests that the BBC will not, and others follow suit, of course, that the BBC will not countenance to be heard. Because you have to think, who writes the news? You hear the news, who writes the news? Someone writes the news. Someone goes through all the things that come in on the teleprompter or the whatever. Somebody says, well, that's important. We'll put that in, and we'll adjoin it to that. And this is how we'll frame it. And then you'll have the current affairs programs. Somebody decides the editorial line. Somebody says, we'll ask that question. We won't ask that one. That's the language we'll use. That's the subtext of our questioning. And the BBC is the past master of this, because the BBC, like the British ruling class, is urbane, sophisticated, nuanced, very subtle, knows how to appear to be fair-minded while actually getting it by the ghoulies. And that's the subtlety of the BBC. And they tell you what to think without you realizing it. And that's why it doesn't represent us. And it goes to the heart of who they are. They've always had political pressure from the 20s onwards. But of course, it's been more intense. I mean, when I joined the BBC in the 1960s, it was very class conscious, but there was a space for a few ruffians from the Midlands in our case, but from other parts of the country to come in and do stuff. That is largely closed up now. Broadcasting, if it deals with people at the lower end of societies, benefit scroungers, poverty porn, fascist TV, really, setting people up to be diminished, demeaned, loathed, derided. You could make a list of what the BBC believes in. The BBC believes in monarchy, and how they believe in monarchy. They believe in organised religion, so yes, I mean, most of the people in the country are probably not religious at all. But you won't get much, thought for the day. When was the last time you heard a humanist or secularist on thought for the day? Don't exist. No other thoughts, no other view of what we might call one's spiritual imagination. Only organised religion gets a hearing. Most of all, they believe in the market. That is the political correctness that the BBC espouses. Don't challenge the market. Politicians are tested on, are you business friendly? That's the test. If you're not business friendly, then obviously you're, unspeakable. The free market equals freedom in the eyes of the establishment and as reflected through television and broadcasting. That's the BBC will hate the far, because the BBC represents the state, not the government. So the BBC will be dismissive of the far right, but give it huge coverage because they're fascinated by it. So you'll see Farage on, and you'll see Trump on wall to wall. They're fascinated by the far right. They deride it, but they're fascinated by it. The far left, did you see Bernie Sanders as much as you saw Donald Trump? No, of course not. They hate Corbyn and the Labour Party now. Absolutely hate it. That's why this whole fraudulent debate about anti-Semitism has been dominating the screens for the last week or so, because it's just before the election. How strange. Anybody who's been involved in the Labour Party and left parties, like many of us, well, some of us here maybe, I've been in and out of it for 50 years, you know there's no anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. The Jewish Socialist Group has written about that. Many Labour Party Jewish members have written about that. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. It'll get an airing because it'll damage Corbyn. They are ruthless in their determination to destroy Corbyn. I don't know if anybody hears the Today programme this morning. If anybody heard it, just 10 to 9, there was a discussion about London airports. We need a London airport. Heathrow must expand. Okay, 2 MPs debated. One of them was Louise, and I didn't catch her second name, but I can guess. I'll leave you to fill in the blank. Was asked, you're a Labour MP. We finished discussion about the airports. You're a Labour MP. Tell me what you think about the anti-Semitism debate. Oh, there's a huge amount of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, apparently. It's not been treated properly. I wish the leadership would get a grip. Thank you, Louise. Thank you. That's just what we wanted to hear. End of the interview. No challenge, no other point of view, just that. The knife in yet again. And anybody who's been following this story will know that it has a political function and it's in line with the BBC's politics. The BBC's political programmes are a joke. Who thinks watching Andrew Neil with that curious haircut is that about politics? About how we live together? About how we teach our children? About how we look after each other when we're ill? How we get work? Is that about politics? Andrew Neil and a few old deadbeats from Westminster? Is it hell? It's nothing to do with it. And the same, even if they patronise us and put it in a studio somewhere outside London, you'll have the same bunch of deadbeats boring us to death again. That's not about politics. Politics is how we live, is how we survive, is how we treat each other. I'm running over time. I just wanted to say a couple of other things really quickly. There is one thing about the broadcasting industry, there is huge exploitation in it. It's run on people trying to get their CVs and working for nothing. It's run on trainees being forced to do overtime without payment. There's huge exploitation. Any inquiry into broadcasting must take that into account. And the BBC must stop commissioning programmes on budgets that they know will require the people making them to exploit their workforce. That must end. We are terrified that Channel 4 will be privatised. We know Spanker Whittingdale was a privatiser. We know he's got Channel 4 in his sights. The Channel 4 must not be privatised. It has deteriorated terribly. It should be reformed and reset and maybe put in the same building as Phil says with the BBC, no problem with buildings. What we want is real courage in commissioning and really independent commissioners. The micromanagement, something else that's never mentioned when they talk about our business. when I began, there was the pyramid of managers and program makers was like that. There were one or two people at the top and a lot of people making programs. The pyramid is now like that. So there's lots of people telling other people what to do, and the person making it, and we've just done an interview for Sky. The cameraman was the recordist, he was the spark, he was driving the van, he was working the communication on top of the van. The director was holding the mic and was also the sound recorder. That's rubbish. You have to get bad work like that. It's not professional. We need to stop the micromanagement from the top and give proper budgets for people to make proper programs. Finally, as I say, there's a huge fear of privatization. But we have to defend public broadcasting. We have to make it genuinely accountable. It has to be based in the regions with proper budgets, and then those programs can be broadcast nationally so that we speak to each other. We want competition in ideas. We want no government control, no appointees from the government telling people what they should be organising and making. It happened under all parties, whether it was Alistair Campbell, Bernard Ingham, it's certainly happening now. It must be independent and it must be democratic, but we must defend public service broadcasting, and my God, we've got to make it better.
Thanks, Ken, very much indeed. Last speaker from the platform is Kat Lewis. Kat is the Joint Creative Director and Executive Producer of 9 Lives Media. Kat.
So my company is in Manchester. I want to start off by asking you a question. Just imagine that the 96 victims of Hillsborough were from London rather than Liverpool. Put your hand up if you think it would have taken less than 27 years to get the correct verdict at inquest. Absolutely, and I agree with you. I watched Hillsborough, the drama written by Jimmy McGovern, go out again on Sunday. That was made 20 years ago. Jimmy wrote it. It was produced by a good friend of mine, Katie Jones, who sadly passed away last year. And Nicola Schindler, who runs Red, was the drama producer. Why did it take 20 years after that drama for the truth to come out? And I've been thinking about that so hard because I remembered it as being brilliant at the time. I was working in the same department. And then when I watched it again, I thought maybe it didn't cover everything, but it did. And then I remembered that that same department, when they made the Birmingham 6 programmes, they actually made 3 programmes before the miscarriage of justice was proved. At that time, Granada was a campaigning force for good within this country. It was doing what all broadcasters and what all programme makers should do, which is to hold the authorities to account. We're the fourth estate. We're the people who question. And that's what the job is. And unfortunately, if all the programmes are made in London and all the programmes are made by upper middle class white people, that's just not going to happen. And that's why I run my company in Manchester, creating jobs here, creating work experience. I have 2 people in every week on work experience. And I don't exploit them. They work for a maximum of, they're in for 1 week or 2 if they really want to, when I don't pay them. And I pay everybody, and we look after everybody, and we don't do overtime. We go home at 7 o'clock. I employ a lot of people part-time because I benefited from part-time work when I was first coming back into television after having my children. And it was Charles Tremaine who did that for me. And he was the same assistant producer who discovered that you can get the same chemical reaction from the back of new playing cards that you can get from gunpowder. And that's what got the Birmingham 6 out of prison. So I have written something, but I just want to say first and foremost that when I was a reporter for BBC News for 3 years, nobody ever read a script. Nobody ever told me what to say. I was writing those scripts and I was delivering them. None of my programmes, my reports were ever watched, and I was never told to change anything. I firmly believe the BBC is independent. We're one of the main independent suppliers for Panorama. And yes, we work with the editorial team at Panorama, but nobody tells us what to say. We come up with our own investigations. We're one of 3 independents with an output deal for Channel 4 dispatches. And that's equally a very, very important programme. Now, we can't turn the clock back and make ITV the broadcaster it was. Unfortunately, those programmes like the Birmingham 6 inquiry, like Hillsborough, aren't being made by ITV because they've massively reduced the amount of money they spend on current affairs. Nobody wants to sit around and watch politicians on television talking around a round table, but those are very cheap programmes to make, and they keep the politicians happy, and therefore Granada still make them. It doesn't surprise me, well, ITV, sorry, it's called now. It doesn't surprise me that, the figures haven't gone down, because that's not the kind of journalism we need more of, to be frank, and that's why, we all feel disengaged politically. But there are 2 things. We can't turn the clock back because Granada became ITV on the back of the talent of the Northwest programme makers, in my view, and then wanted to go down a commercial line, has done deals with successive governments to be able to do that. We can't change that. Unfortunately, the 10-year franchise was just reissued to ITV last year. They're not going to change. They're going to carry on doing what they do as a commercial organisation. There are 2 things we can do, and this is really a call to arms. One is that if the white paper, when it's published next week about the BBC, does threaten its independence and does reduce the licence fee further, then we must all protest, because it is our BBC. We pay for it, and we have to hold it to account, and we mustn't let the government take control. It's got to still be programme makers that make those decisions. And the second call to arms is the threat that's over Channel 4 at the moment of privatisation. Quite rightly, Ken has talked about that, and it's a very, very real issue. John Whittingdale seems to be enamoured about the idea of privatising Channel 4, and what I really worry about is that what will happen is exactly what has happened with ITV. Peter Kaminsky wrote a brilliant article in The Guardian about this. ITV used to have, a fantastic tradition of current affairs and investigative programmes, and that disappeared when it went down a commercial route. Channel 4 at the moment does make fantastic current affairs programmes. Escape from ISIS, which won the Royal Television Society International Journalism Award this year, is an absolutely extraordinary programme that I'd urge you to watch if you haven't watched it. And there was also a fantastic domestic programme that again won the RTS Journalism Award for the best domestic current affairs programme, and that was called Kids in Crisis, and it was about the mental health cuts that have resulted in children being kept miles away from their families when they're at their most vulnerable. They're going through terrible crises, and yet they're miles away from home, away from the immediate love and support that they could get from their families. They're 2 very important programmes. So I don't believe that Channel 4 has stopped making good programmes. I don't believe that for 1 minute. The structure at the moment at Channel 4 is that they have, yes, more commercial programmes like First Dates, which appeal to a wide audience, Gogglebox, which represents the country. They haven't got Scottish or Irish contributors in there yet, which they need to do, but essentially it reflects the country in a positive way. And I think that, those commercial programmes then help pay for the investigations, the current affairs, the 7 o'clock news, which I'm sure many of you watch and enjoy. And it's really important that the way Channel 4 works is protected, and we all have a voice. It's so much easier than it was. You can email John Whittingdale, you can tell him what you think. You can, if you believe this, you can say that you think that the current situation where we have a non-for-profit Channel 4, which acts as a very good balance for the BBC. It's a great competitor for the BBC, and that makes the television that we all produce, far higher in standard. And you can make your views known, because otherwise it's a few, quid that the government are going to make, but then years down the line, everything's going to be resting on the BBC in terms of making these programmes that are so important in terms of holding people to account.
Well, you've heard four accounts. I'll just add something. Ken made a very interesting and important point. About 40 years ago, I read the best leader I've ever read. It was in Time magazine. It was written by a man called Roger Rosenblatt. It was entitled, "What Should We Lead With?" And what he was posing, he'd been the editor at the time, he was posing the fact that the editor of a newspaper, or indeed editor of a news programme, has to decide, as Ken says, what do I think you should be interested in? It's a hugely important decision. And once an editor's made that decision, he's set the agenda, other people then follow that agenda. So to a degree, Ken's absolutely right. We constantly are being fed what somebody else decides is the things we should know. And I put it to you, it's very lucky for us that we're having this meeting here this evening, immediately after the announcements of last week and the verdicts of last week. Let me put this to you. The two moments I actually thought Cameron performed best in Parliament, certainly the last session of Parliament, were the two apologies, the Hillsborough apology, do you remember, and the Bloody Sunday apology. Now, I live in Ireland, so the Bloody Sunday apology was something very important to me. What I found extraordinary was, I remember, they did it here in Liverpool, they did it in Belfast. They cut outside to a crowd waiting to hear what the Prime Minister's going to say. And when he announced, basically it was an apology, the crowd erupted with joy. Just as I think happened here last week. And what that says to me is, all people want is the truth. Tell us the truth. If there'd been a cover-up, but why is it made so difficult to get to the truth? That's where I think the central core of Ken's argument is. Why has it become so extraordinarily difficult to get to the truth? And here's the real worry for me. Huge amount of coverage of Hillsborough at the moment. But that media wagon is going to move on. What we have to do, and what I think television has to do, is keep asking why. Why did it take so long? What went on? It isn't the event, it's the subterranean influences that make getting to the truth so unbelievably hard. And yet, when we do get there, there's amazing emotional release from ourselves when we kind of know it. We knew it all along, and now we're hearing that we were right. That to me is what the national conversation is. And that's what I personally believe broadcasters' obligation is. Keep going on until we find out why these things happen, who colluded with who, and why, and who benefited. So I would beg you, don't think this is the end of the Hillsborough story. It isn't the end until we find out why that happened and what triggered it. And have we got some very, very unfortunate thing in our own body politic that somehow will brush things under the covers, keep the truth away because we're not ready for it. Effectively being treated like children. So in that sense, I'm very sympathetic with what Ken said. Okay, over to you. Who'd like to start? So.
Thank you. I think probably with the Orgreave debate now becoming apparent with the miners' strike, I think the role of the South Yorkshire Police, that'll keep Hillsborough in the spotlight, as well as what happened with the miners. And also I'd like to ask, why did it take the BBC up until fairly recently to show or produce evidence that they knew at Hillsborough they had evidence, not only from people who were reporting there, but actual film evidence? It seems to me that, as usual, members of the public have had to sort of fight for all these years, when really it should have been done by, like as you say, public service broadcaster.
Ken, you did miners' strike.
Yes, I think you make a very good point. And Orgreave is the next big issue. We know the police copied their accounts of what were these arrests so that they could convict the miners, and we know that they fell down. Then we know that they've falsified the evidence, and yet they're not being prosecuted. You're dead right. But even bigger than that, you know, is the issue of what happened during the strike. Because once the government had won the strike, yes, 20 years later, 30 years later, they can say, oh yeah, oh dear, we did a few bad things there. Never mind, it's history. The point is, during the strike, and I don't know if you remember, people here, the story was picket line violence. That was the story night after night after night. Even Kate Adie, the well-respected Kate Adie, time after time, violence on the picket lines. Now, I did a little film about the time. I stood on the picket lines, but not on the police side, and I saw the police with their £5 notes, £10 notes in the police vans, taunting the miners with them. I saw them beat the miners up. But of course, it wasn't only about police violence, it was about pit closures. That was not discussed during the strike. That was not discussed. So they manipulated the issue. Now with the junior doctors, it's damage to harm to patients. It's not with the doctors that are talking about the privatisation of the health service. They're not talking about payments. They're talking about privatisation of the health service. You will not hear that discussed on broadcast by the broadcasters until it's over. Then the critical battle is over, the government has won. Yeah, they can talk about it endlessly then, because they've won. Why were the Liverpool dockers, their huge struggle, why was that never broadcast? Why were there no documentaries there? Why was there no discussion with the dockers on one side and management on the other, and talking about casualisation and losing the security of work? Because that's what that was about. And now, look at all the young people now in the grip of agency work, casualised labour, short-term contracts, scrambling from one bit of a job to another. That the Liverpool dockers fought on that. The critical time to talk about casualisation of that was then, when the dispute was on. When the dispute was lost, yeah, talk about it, doesn't matter. They won. And that's how they do it.
Thanks, Ken, very much indeed. Phil.
I think all of these issues go back to the same thing, which is about where does the media make the decision? What news does the media decide to cover? And that, I have to say, from sort of working in it for so long, it is always down to the same decision every business makes, which is like, where are we going to put our resources? And so it's, where are they going to pay the expenses for people to more and more travel up from London to stay, to actually spend the time actually getting at the truth? And as we sort of talked about here, over the years, the resources have been more and more pulled away from current affairs and news. So people can't actually spend the time getting at the truth. So what they go for all the time is like, where's the soundbite and what's the next stage after the soundbite? And that's why it takes so long. And with Hillsborough, I mean, I remember watching it live on television, and you could see what was happening. You could see that all someone needed to do was intervene a lot more quickly. But the overriding agenda of the day was that they just didn't know what was going on, And then from the media's point of view, it was up to somebody else to sort out, And that's why, it's taken a long, long time, because of this thing about the way the establishment always conforms to the norm, and it takes a long time to break that. And it was only actually when Andy Burnham had that reception at Anfield and realised that it wasn't going to go away. And he went back and made them listen and made it actually go, set up the inquiry. And actually, to her credit, it was Theresa May who drove it on, But the media were only watching that as a political story because they didn't have the resources and they didn't have the people who actually understood what it was. And for all those years while it was going on, I mean, we used to argue with Channel 4 about where the publicity of the programme would be, and they always wanted it to be in the Sun because the Sun had the best demographic for the Channel 4 audience. And they just never got it. And that phrase which we've all heard about, can't you get over it? It just kept coming back and back and back, but we never, ever, ever sort of moved anywhere away from the fact that we would not take part then with the Sun. But, and then, so that's really the pragmatic thing. And then the other thing comes back to the point about who writes the news. Well, before you even get to that stage, someone's got to decide what news they actually want to write about. And I still think that the BBC is a lot more independent than people, will say. But you go back to a point David made about the 1990 Broadcasting Act. And when I said that it eviscerated television, what that 1990 Broadcasting Act did was introduce the concept of family viewing, right, which meant that everything on television, on British television, had to be suitable for a family audience. And it then started to add in other things like susceptible adults. You couldn't do anything that was imitable behaviour for a susceptible adult. And then for the ITV companies, like Granada, there was also a change, because pre-1990, if you had a difficult subject, you could go to the regulator and say, we want to do this. We want to do domestic violence. We want to do drugs. We want to do this. This is what we're thinking of doing. And then the regulator would say, well, okay, if you do this, you do that, we'll be okay, whatever. After 1990, that was outlawed. And the thing was, you transmit and then you take the consequences. And the ultimate sanction for the commercial companies was 3% of their advertising revenue. Now, Brookie got 2 yellow cards, and Channel 4 got really close. Right? And after that, in the middle of the 1990s, we were constantly being told that is now unsuitable for transmission on British television. In 1996, the Jordache saga was the biggest story soap had ever covered. The crews came from America to see that, because they couldn't believe that we were handling that story of domestic violence, murder, incest at 8 o'clock in primetime television. In 2001, 5 years later, we wanted to do a retrospective, and they told us it was unsuitable for primetime television. Right? That's what the 1990 Broadcasting Act did. It eviscerated it. So every time you get to a difficult programme, like going back to Hillsborough, like going back to Orgreave, where you're going to take on the establishment, you're going to name names, you're going to get into legal battles, suddenly the room filled with lawyers, and suggestions were made. Perhaps we shouldn't do it that way, perhaps we should do it this way. Leave it to others, Now that is what that 1990 Broadcasting Act did to television. And that's why in the end, I decided to get out of it, because by 2001, 2002, it had become Mary Poppins television. And then you could try and get people to take drugs, you could try and get people to have sex live on television. But if you really wanted to cover an issue about why, the state wasn't doing more about drugs, why wasn't the state doing more about unemployment, why wasn't the state doing more about our failing education system, very, very, very difficult.
Kat. Thanks.
I just want to make one more quick point about Hillsborough. If you think about that drama going out in 1996, exposing the miscarriage of justice very clearly, why did the new Labour government not do anything? And I think when we think of politics, we have to think about people like Murdoch. Was it because Tony Blair didn't want to upset his new best friend, Rupert Murdoch? Was that the real reason why it took so long? It took up until 2009 for Gordon Brown to then launch the inquiry, which has resulted, obviously, in the inquest being overturned. And I think at the moment, what we've got to remember when we read the newspaper is that the BBC has got a lot of enemies. Murdoch hates the BBC, and so does the Daily Mail, and lots of other newspapers. And so the BBC is under attack on a daily basis in all those newspapers. And that's why I think, it's not a perfect institution. I'm not pretending it is, but we should rally round, because it is under threat and it's all about money. They don't want the BBC to give you news because they want to sell you news. And that's what it comes down to. And we have to be really careful about that politics.
Let's say, the truth is, and I accept many of the criticisms that Ken makes. Lord knows we've all had a frustration with the BBC. But it does come down to us. The big fight post the white paper, and I promise you this is not going to change, will be over the governance of the BBC. And it'll be over the right of the government to appoint the board, of a new unitary board of the BBC. If you're prepared to live with that, that is what will happen. If you're not, and I believe this could be done, We need actually the largest single march there's ever been in Britain, because it's the one occasion on which all classes, for different reasons in this country, will gather. Worcester women will gather because they don't want to lose Radio 4. You actually could get a quite extraordinary outpouring. You know, I still can't get the fact that 700,000 people turned up for the Hunting with Hounds demonstration. If we can't get 2 million out, there's something wrong with us. If we seriously are not concerned enough to ensure the independence of the BBC. Independence of the BBC will come from the independence of the board. The independence of the board will come from the way it's selected and appointed. If we're not prepared to fight for that, we'll end up with all of Ken's concerns and much worse. So it will come down to us in the end. Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, Megan. Sorry, can I ask you?
Yeah.
In this competitive market that we now live in, with the advent of broadcasting, can I ask you quite sincerely, what is it that you think that the BBC are so afraid of? Because at the end of the day, we're all in competition.
Yep.
If Leicester City can win the Premiership, why are we so afraid to fight in the game and fight for good broadcasting?
I don't know. As I know Ken's going to leave in 7 or 8 minutes, I'll start with him and we'll get everyone to chip in on that.
I think the BBC are afraid, have been cowed by politicians over decades, since its inception. I mean, they're caught in this bind. On the one hand, they've got to attract a mass audience to justify everybody paying for it. If only a few people pay for it, then if only a few people watch it, why should everybody pay for it? It's like the opera. So they have to attract a mass audience. But then, as has been said, the commercial guys say, well, hang on, you're interfering with our competition because you're getting a subsidy and we're having to attract advertising. So it's not fair. So because they're afraid, or the political left, I would say, is afraid to say broadcasting is a service that we should all contribute to, that we should all enjoy, that we should reflect everyone, and we should all have a democratic say in it, and we should all pay for it fairly. So I think that's what we have to campaign for. I'm absolutely in support of public broadcasting service. I don't believe, and I do have to challenge David on this, it is not independent. What happens is the press will have a story, the BBC editors will recognise, yes, this fits with what we can do. They will carry it. I mean, the anti-Semitism is a classic because it's a complete bubble. It's a classic case. And they all knock it backwards and forward. It's like an elaborate dance. Everybody understands the steps, so you don't need to conspire. Everybody understands the steps, so they all perform it. And the story goes backwards and forward because they all have a common enemy. And the BBC is not only cowed by politicians, but it has a class bias. It's always had a class bias. It did when I joined in the mid-60s, early 60s. It was patrician, it was urbane, it was generous, it allowed space. Then, under Thatcher, it got cowed. Its programmes, you remember There Is No Alternative, it became much more commercial. It was, its political spaces closed down. So certainly in terms of drama, you didn't get those subversive pieces that they hated. And then finally, it has become micromanaged, corporate, and diminished in its output, diminished in its imagination, diminished in its ambition. We have to fight, we absolutely have to fight for it, but we have to fight to get it back and improve it and make it a people's television, not the television of the establishment.
It's quite dangerous. I should point out that our inquiry from day one has been about the role and the future of public service broadcasting. It's not about the BBC, it's not about Channel 4, it's about public service broadcasting, what its role is and what are the challenges that affect its future. How much do we value it? That's really important. Ruth?
I'm nothing to add to the
No?
argument. No.
anyone think to add what Ken just had to say about what are we afraid of?
What I feel is very important that hasn't been said yet is that we have quotas at the moment, which means that the broadcasters, all the public service broadcasters, have to commission programmes from out of London. And that's something, again, that we've all got to fight for. They do occasionally cheat those quotas. They insist upon you editing in London because there's only a particular editor that they want you to use, and he happens to be in London. And that makes it very difficult because we then have to employ a programme maker who's based in London. Otherwise, we have to try and find 7 weeks overnight money for the programme maker who we want to employ from the Northwest to go down there. And that becomes kind of self-perpetuating because then you end up without a talent pool of what they consider to be network calibre people who are out of London. And I've seen this over the 14 years that I've been working as an executive producer, and it's very frustrating. But I shout about it, you know, I make a fuss deliberately. I know that makes me vulnerable, but I don't care because I believe in it. I believe in making programmes out of London that everybody should have the opportunity to get their voice heard. We need a creative meritocracy, and we can only have that if people from every different background can work in television. And, you know, you go back to the days, I can see Hazel in the audience from John Moore's, and she and I were at Granada at a time when Peter Kay came through, you know, fantastic comedian. Where would his career have started had Granada not existed in the way that it existed? You know, Carolina Hearn, Steve Coogan started on a show that I produced. You know, countless fantastic people, brilliant script writers like Paul Abbott, Jimmy McGovern, Kay Mellor, all from working class backgrounds, all from the north. And these people need to have somewhere to get their work experience, to get their first job. And yes, you know, people say, well, anybody can make television on a mobile phone. Yes, it's true. We can make little videos on a mobile phone. But that isn't the same as sitting alongside other brilliant creatives and coming up with programme ideas and getting those programme ideas broadcast. The little clip that was shown at the beginning, do you know that happened with Nicola Schindler, who's absolutely brilliant, who runs Red Productions in Manchester? That happened with Last Tango in Halifax. Can you believe that? Last Tango in Halifax was rejected, went years and years. And then, fortunately, somebody at the BBC, that dopey guy, you know, on the settee who was suggesting that, you know, or turned down to Walthamstow, whatever, you know, somebody like him suddenly remembered that there was this great drama set up in the north, and for some reason they'd suddenly been told they needed more northern things. Unfortunately, he remembered, and suddenly after many years, you know, we've all got the multi-BAFTA winning Last Tango in Halifax, thank goodness.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks very much. It's quite interesting. As Ken leaves, I think he'll be interested to know, in the 2001-2002 Broadcast Communications Act, the biggest single fight we had, and it went on and on, it's all in Hansard, happily, was a debate about, this were the words, I've just jotted them down here. The opening of the bill was about the purpose of Ofcom, that's to say the purpose of the regulator was going to regulate television. And the opening words originally were that it should have regard to the interests of the consumer. And we fought for days and days and days, and we got rid of the word consumer and we inserted the word citizen. Now, this is a slightly depressing fact. It is the only time in legislation, Ruth, they tell you I'm wrong, it's the only time in legislation where the word citizen is actually in a bill, because we're not citizens, we're subjects. Our argument was, in respect of the provision of information, we have to be citizens. We're not consumers. We consume as the choices we make about what we consume. But our rights and the obligation of broadcasters to be truthful are obligations to us as citizens. That was a massive fight, and it was won. So it's not all despair, but literally that small one word was fought over for nights and nights and nights. I find it very interesting. Another question. Ma'am.
Yes. Right. You spoke about us having the largest march over the BBC. Now, whenever there's been protest marches through London in the last 12 months, 2 years, and the BBC hasn't covered them either properly or at all. There was one 2 weeks ago, the People's Assembly March, which wasn't covered, as far as I know, on primetime TV by the BBC or ITV. Also, with regard to broadcasting certain things like sell-off over the NHS, and there's another film that was made called Still the Enemy Within over the miners' strike, and within that there's documentation which was released over Margaret Thatcher's time as Prime Minister, and it came out that, you know, the police, the South Yorkshire police, were the culprits, that they committed violence against the miners, not the other way round. Now, the BBC won't, refuse to put that in their programming. Same with sell-off over the NHS and over fracking Gasland, which has also been refused by, the public broadcasting. So I'd like to know whether you can do something about that, or...
I'm going to ask Kat with a very specific question, because we're going to run out of time. How much more difficult or less difficult is it to get commissioned to make a programme? Exactly the question, the conversation. If you want to make a programme, a really in-depth programme about fracking, the impact of fracking, how tough would it be to get the commission?
Well, it always depends upon, what's been made already. Ironically, because that wonderful Hillsborough programme, which won a BAFTA, had been made, that would have put other broadcasters and other programme makers off making an in-depth programme, because it had told the story. The story was out there. It was the government that then refused to do anything about it. Now, I don't know who made the Orgreave programme. I do agree that at times the BBC can be on a back foot about these things rather than campaigning, but I would like to mention a very good programme that was made here in Liverpool and was broadcast on BBC One and has resulted in a change of law, and that's Common, written by Jimmy McGovern, produced by my friend Colin McEwen, who runs LA Productions here in Liverpool, a very brilliant company. And at the end of that programme, Charlotte Moore, who's one of the most senior women now in television, doing a fantastic job in charge of BBC One, BBC Two, the iPlayer, she agreed that they would be able to broadcast one of the mothers of the real victims talking effectively about her campaign. And now the law has changed, and that, the whole business of kind of, if you're part of a gang, you're going to be just as guilty as the person who wielded the knife, that is now... no longer the case, and a lot of those people who were convicted under that law are going to, their cases are going to go back to the Court of Appeal. So I do think, we've got to think about the BBC. They're not going to cover everything. They do cover as much as they can. Channel 4 do as well. What's really important is that, Channel 4 and the BBC are the two broadcasters who enable me to run my company. I make a lot of children's programmes, I make a lot of current affairs, I'm not interested in money, and my team, aren't interested in money. We're interested in making the programmes that should be made. We make some commercial programmes in order to support the children's and the current affairs programmes that we make. If Channel 4 and the BBC are under threat, then we're under threat, and that makes it difficult for me to create the jobs that I do up here in the Northwest for programme makers. And that's because Channel 4 take more seriously the importance of making programmes out of London than other broadcasters, and so does the BBC. The BBC is actually the best at it, and they really are committed to 50% of programmes being made out of London, not only by in-house BBC departments, but also by companies like mine.
you, darling. Ruth, the question there in a sense was what you can do about it. If you could have a magic wand and look at it from your own perspective, as someone who works in the world, in the political world, what would you change? Literally, if you could write the remit of public service broadcasting, Channel 4, BBC, in a way that you believe would begin to deal with this democratic deficit that I insist does exist, and make people more aware of the decisions of their own lives and have more influence on the decisions of their own lives, what would you alter?
2 minutes.
In 2 minutes. 3.
3. Okay, it's been generous. I mean, I'm slightly stumped. Fundamentally, I think one of the things it goes back to your earlier point about how the public are seen as consumers or citizens. And I think it goes also to your governance issue about thinking about what we as the public, as citizens, what is a priority for us? What serves our democratic needs? And that will be different, slightly different in different parts of the country. It's different in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and so on. But I would have a fundamental rethink about what, in democratic terms, the public interest is in terms of broadcasting, and how that then needs to be written in, reflected, and required in the legislation. And that would lead, I think, to some quite difficult debates and decisions about allocation of funding for programming and prioritisation of that. But I suppose what I would want to get away from is this idea that political programming is purely about talking heads sitting around a table discussing issues in Westminster. And if there can be more a structure and a process, a governance structure that drives a decision-making process within our broadcasters to think differently about us as citizens and about fundamentally their responsibility to the state, the democratic health of the country, that's what I would want to achieve. How I would do that in a practical way, as somebody who is not experienced in terms of in the way that these our other panelists are in television, would be quite difficult because I don't have that background. But that's what I would want to see happen.
Phil, public interest. Thanks.
Actually, I think it's quite easy, actually, after spending 35 years thinking about this. What you have at the moment is that you've got this fantastic platform called BBC iPlayer. Right? You've got the BBC's got access to something like 10 transmission channels, and it's got all its radio networks, and a lot of them are underused. So I think what you should say is, first of all, we need to define what do we really mean by public service broadcasting, and that means, service to the public. And I think it has to sort of follow the devolution agenda. I think it has to start thinking about it. We're going to start putting all our services out to the regions and the areas and elected mayors so that everything is controlled by elected representatives. I think the BBC as public service broadcaster should follow that same model. I think you can use the iPlayer as the test bed of the innovatory expert lab for anybody to come along with a programme. The BBC can curate it, they can put it out, if the public like it, they can take it on. The same way that Amazon and Netflix are now putting a programme out and saying, we're thinking about making this series, shall we carry on or not? Then I think you then end up with things like, we'd have BBC Council as well as BBC Parliament. Because the thing about politicians is that they only do stuff if they think they're going to get caught. And I think, BBC Parliament is there because the journals can actually look on, bring it down, and they can say, you said this, you said that. And that's a much more effective way than trying to get 3 of them in a studio with Andrew Neil and his dodgy haircut, as Ken said. So I think, some of those BBC channels could be put towards local politics rather than national politics. They should be the test beds for innovation. So I think the BBC should inform, educate, entertain, and innovate. Remember, there was the BBC who brought on the micro. It was the BBC who brought on the iPlayer. And I think this notion of privatising Channel 4 is a red herring, because all Channel 4 is it's got a particular mechanism. It's got another part of the spectrum that it actually transmits on. And it was brought in the 1980s for a particular reason, to fill gaps that were not being served by the other broadcasters. Those gaps are now being well served by everybody. But it's got a fantastic critical mass, it's got a great production capability. That could be absorbed by the BBC, and that would give us a broadcaster that does cradle to grave. The BBC is tend to do very young and sort of middle-aged on. Channel 4 does the bit in the middle. So you put them together, you get a broadcast that can look at everything. I still think it's fine for the Channel 4's revenue, sell advertising revenue, because advertising actually is one of the most creative forms we've got in Britain. And a lot of people, as you know from your own early career, that's where some of the fantastic ideas, the use of the technology, nuances and things develop. So that should stay in it. And that money can then supplement what the BBC licence fee. And then I think you do release the commercial organisations. And I think this idea of competition is looked at from the same way, from the wrong way. Whether we've joined David's march or not, the BBC belongs to us. We pay our taxes. We want it to be there, right? Everybody, actually, in every poll, everybody says the BBC is a good thing. We want to keep it. You've got to remember its social impact. It's not just about whether it does strictly. It also does DIY, SOS. And they will get it. The BBC roll up and say, we're going to do the community centre. It gets done, right? They're the ones who do great shows for the Olympics. They're the ones who cover Her Majesty and all the rest of it, right? The BBC has a lot of social impact that it doesn't actually do. Things like the A-Team at Radio Merseyside. Brilliant things. Get the community involved. The commercial companies are free there. So the Competition Act is actually, we the taxpayer want the best public service broadcaster that we can get. We want to innovate. We want to create Monty Python again, don't we? We want to do shows like that, you know. We want to do edgy drama like Ken used to make and what I used to make. You know, the BBC can be the test bed for that. And if they are then commercial, they can be taken up. Top Gear, it's now going to be done by Amazon. There's nothing wrong in that. That's just the ecology of the business. So the BBC should be the best thing that we want. You know, it should be the best iPlayer. It should be the best used website. And the commercial companies have to compete with that. You know, and if they can't compete with it, well, they shouldn't be in business. And the thing that drives me mad more than anything else is when the local newspapers roll up and say, oh, the BBC is killing our business. It's not. The internet is what has killed local press. It used to be the place where you sold your bike. Now, why would you do that? Why would you pay a local newspaper when you can go to Gumtree or you can go on eBay or whatever? You know, that business has been killed by the internet, not the BBC. So that's the way I'd change it, you know. And to me, after 40 years of going round and round and round and round this carousel, it is a very simple solution. Will it happen? No. Why won't it happen? Because we have to go back again to this thing. Who writes the news, right? Who decides what news it is? Then you look at recruitment. The BBC and broadcasting in general now is now back where it was when I decided in 1970 I wanted to be part of it. And I ran straight into, boom, the Oxbridge Wall. It's back. They're all there. They commission within their own image now. The people who can afford to spend a year not being paid are probably from that kind of demographic in Oxbridge. Recruitment, access, that's the next big problem. So we need to define, what do we mean by public service broadcasting? We need to ask the public, are they prepared to keep paying it? And we have to start thinking about who recruits the people in broadcasting, what kind of access can we get? And one final thought I'll leave you with is, if you want to go and join David's march, one of the things you should think about, do you want to keep paying your licence fee, which is the daily equivalent of a copy of The Sun, or not?
And wrap up with Kat. This business about what the public want to see or are interested in. One of my favourite Liverpudlians, by a long way, and I've worked with him for 25 years one way or another, is Sir Ken Robinson. Ken Robinson wrote a book, it was 25 years ago, about what was wrong with education and the role of creativity within education. Not a lot of people really argued with it, but on the other hand, it was quite tough to get an audience for it. If you go on the Ken Robinson's TED Talk today, it's been seen by 38 million people. 38 million people have found that online and watched Ken's talk. Ken still hasn't been offered by any of the British broadcasters a series on which he can actually discuss this thing. Now, I'm devoted to David Attenborough, but the idea that we have on our hands the world's the world's expert, critical expert on education and the young, and we have never given him a platform in Britain. And his platform is 38 million people on TED. That's the bottom of where I find something very, very strange going on. Why? Because what essentially Ken's doing is challenging the entire educational establishment. And there's a nervousness of even beginning to get that air.
Actually, in Liverpool, we are giving Ken a platform. Ken's been working with me on the Creative Commission, and he's also been working on what we should do in education for the next 30 years. So at least we recognise him, because he's a Scouser.
Well,
the only problem is, he's an Evertonian.
I was trying to get a cheap applause line. So, that's the last question.
I just wanted to ask, given that we're talking about public service broadcasting, why isn't it more democratic? So if somebody is getting that sort of viewership online, why can't we vote for them to have airtime? And a simple question, I really don't see why we can't do that. Because I think
it's very interesting.
If we are looking to change things like the BBC from the outside, we need to do some innovative stuff. And yes, we can address grassroots things like yourself, having people for short-term work experience that more people can afford to do. It's still going to take, even if all of those people get employed, it's still going to take them, decades to get into the position of being decision makers about programmes. So that can't work by itself. Regional programming and regionally based companies, I think, are going to have a bigger impact, because once they're making this sort of quality of work, it can't be ignored quite as easily. But beyond that, I think if they're democratic, they need to be democratically accountable. Or if they're publicly based, they need to be publicly accountable.
Okay, let me reinterpret that as opposed to Kat for a second and say, what other forms of access could you create? How could you create a more democratic form of access as opposed to, let's say, the commissioning process that you have become adjusted to working with?
Well, I think there is a wonderful movement happening thanks to the internet, because the new Sun is probably being born at the moment, or has been born in Manchester. Unilad, is a big online magazine, effectively, competitor to the Sun. Lad Bible, and various different versions, because there's Last Bible and kind of Mank Bible and all sorts of things. And what's happening with those online newspapers / magazines is that they're being made by very diverse, huge kind of teams of young people, and they are broadcasting internationally. And they are getting a huge amount of advertising revenue. So these kind of what started as a little kind of, university experiments are now kind of genuinely threatening the Sun and other newspapers. And that can happen, all over the country. Young people can actually broadcast, directly online. And television is taking notice. I think we are, behind the times, and I think we need to sit up and take more notice. And I love your idea of people voting for, television programmes to be commissioned. I think that's brilliant. But I do think things are happening online.
What you're really describing is something like the 100,000 signature that creates a bill. It would be a version of that, wouldn't it? It's a very, very interesting thought. That's one we'll take back, I promise you. That's just made the entire, you've made my day, actually, tell the truth. I'm going to finish with Ruth, because in a sense she's data-driven. She understands these issues. She publishes, in my judgment, the best publication, or certainly one I look forward to most each year, Audit of Political Engagement, because he didn't pay me anything at all for that. Because it does tell us the way in which we, in a sense, are being used and are using media. And if we begin to understand that, then we begin to be real democrats and begin to have an influence. If we don't understand the degree to which we are able to be manipulated, we're not really living in democracy. And that's why I have great sympathy in much of what Ken has to say. Ruth, you're going to have the last word.
Just a couple of things. Just going back to some of the earlier discussion about whether or not, if God forbid, a sort of a Hillsborough were to happen again in that kind of similar tragedy, and where were the broadcasters? One thing I think would be a backstop that's very different today, but doesn't fit terribly well with what the broadcasters want to talk about, is that Parliament itself would be there, in the sense that our select committees are now a much, much more powerful instrument of scrutiny than ever they were 20, 30 years ago. And they, combined with broadcasters, would provide a powerful voice of scrutiny that wasn't there in the past. Imagine a scenario, a tragedy happened in a football ground next week, in the last week of the season, and the following week, Keith Vaz, Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, would be in front of a camera announcing a major inquiry and investigation into it. That's no guarantee of what the outcome might be or things being quicker, but I think you'd have a different type of scrutiny and a different approach to it, which would combine with the broadcasters. And on that last point, I think that is a really interesting question. I'd written just a note to David earlier about, in terms of political coverage, what we need is more openness about what the audience share is. It's very difficult to find out how many people are actually watching these programmes and what the demographics are, how and why they pick the issues that they do, and what role the public could play in that. If the public, through the e-petition system, can sign up to issues that they care about with a view to trying to get a debate in Parliament, it doesn't seem unreasonable to me to think that a similar system could be utilised to enable the public to influence the decisions that broadcasters make. Broadcasters would still have the final decision and still have the creative input, but it would at least help to, I think, change the agenda, and particularly at the regional level. So that's certainly something worth taking up and exploring further.
Thanks, Ruth, very much indeed. Can you make it really tight? Because we're otherwise going to get, we're all going to get slung out. Sorry, there's a mic there. You've got it.
I just wanted to say, as regards to the anniversary of the missing daughter of Kate and Jerry McCann is today, and I feel like that her, excuse me, I'm really nervous, that the portrayal in the media has not been so much of a bias, and please don't condemn me for I'm not giving an opinion on this matter, but they have been viewed differently because they are middle class. Now I'm working class, I've been to Liverpool University as a mature student like Phil has. He's very proud of his roots. That's right, isn't it, Phil? But I feel like they have been portrayed differently in the media because they are middle class. So that's just my comments on because we were talking earlier about, that's all I wanted to say really. I'm not making any comments about whether... No. I just feel they've been portrayed a little bit differently in the media because if they were working class, they would be a little bit more criticised for how they treated their... they basically sat on the veranda or the patio or whatever, and they left them asleep in bed. But I feel like they've been portrayed a little bit differently in the media because they're middle class. But if it was somebody from Liverpool or from the Northwest, they would possibly be condemned a little bit more. And they have been interviewed on TV, and because she's a GP and she's articulate and he's a cardiologist... that they have been given a little bit...
I think I understand what you're saying. I think that, honestly, a lot of this is fashion. It does come down, Ken said it right at the beginning, it does come down to writers. It's writers grasping issues
that's the point I'm
and
trying
getting
to
access.
make.
Yeah.
Because you said some questions are blocked, didn't you? One of the speakers said that some questions are blocked as to what the media asked to people. Is that correct? Can you confirm that or refute it?
Can you just ask again? Sorry, I'm not quite sure.
It's quite hard to... There's a terrible
It's quite
echo
hard
up
to
here.
hear you at this...
We're hearing every third word.
Sorry. All I wanted to say really was that I feel like it's nothing to do with the anniversary of Madam McCann's disappearance. The anniversary is today. And I know their parents have gone through a lot of heartache over her disappearance. But I feel like because her mother is a GP and he's a cardiologist, i.e. they're middle class, that they have been portrayed differently in the media as opposed to somebody that it's happened to in Liverpool or the Northwest generally.
Well, I think that Ben Needham's case, and I know Ben Needham's family...
Thank you for listening to me.
Yeah, no, and Ben Needham's case was also kind of covered, and has been over many years, but I think Maddie McCann's parents have run a very effective campaign to keep their daughter's case kind of in the headlines and to ensure that the inquiry carried on. I'm really sorry, I didn't hear Maddie's name, and that's why I couldn't kind of follow it. Yeah. Sorry.
Can I give you an example? There's a very, very good film indeed, and it's called Chasing the Devil, that was made, a documentary, well worth seeing, about the thalidomide catastrophe, looking back at it, and I had completely forgotten what a disaster it was. I mean, how really the magnitude of the disaster. There's a very interesting fact about this. that when distillers were nailed, the company that distributed the thalidomide pills, when they were really in the end nailed, they offered a settlement, pathetic settlement, to all the parents of children that had been affected. And only one guy, because he was quite wealthy, middle-class bloke, refused to accept the settlement. But distillers had made the argument that unless everyone took the settlement, there were going to be no settlements. This particular bloke in the end got vilified by a lot of the other people for not accepting the money because they wanted to have the money. But because he stood out, because he wouldn't give in, they all ended up, with a big court case, and everyone did get proper recompense in the end. So I don't have an issue with the idea that in the end there are people who want a quiet life, want to settle, and basically, in a sense, want to forget. And there will always be individuals, and I think Jerry McCann was one, who will not leave it alone. You saw it during the Leveson inquiry. I can't tell you how many people I know that took money to go away and be quiet. And 3 or 4 people just wouldn't. So there's that wonderful, is it Thomas Paine's remark, that for evil to triumph, it only requires for good people to do nothing. So I come back to the issue that it is about us. It's about our preparedness, our determination, our commitment to the things we believe in. Because if we give up, as many people do, if we give up, evil will triumph. It just does. It's stronger than us. It's got the market behind it, and it will beat us. We only got each other. And I think that's one of the reasons we've been going around the country, gathering up views as best we can, because in the end, our report will only be as good as the voices it represents. And they will not, I promise you, be the voices of the establishment. Thank you all very, very much for being. And I'm going to finish actually with a thank you, because it's a rather belated thank you. 35 years ago on Monday, I was standing out at Bebington Oval, making Chariots of Fire, and we needed 7,500 extras. And we had no way of paying you, as you may remember. So we auctioned a car and a motorbike, one thing or other. And the most frightening moment in my life was everyone was going to be there at 9 o'clock. At 10 to 9, I looked down the road from the Oval, and there was half a dozen people who turned up. And I had no plan B, because it was the only day we could possibly shoot. And suddenly, at 5 to 9, a black line occurred, and people started coming across the horizon, and 6,800 of you turned up. And I've never been so happy to see people in my life. So here's a 35-year belated thank you very much indeed for saving my arse.
It's a great story.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, just one final thing. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the panel, to Phil Redmond, to Ruth, to David, to Ken who's gone, and Kat. 2 things. The bar is still open, and it would really help writing on the wall if as much of you as possible could fill in evaluation forms. It's this kind of thing, getting evaluation, that helps us to continue festivals year after year. This is our 17th year, and we look forward to seeing you at festival events throughout the month of May. Thank you very much for coming.